Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to go to Oxford, England, which is always a thrill for me because I think of Oxford as probably the most prestigious and kind of elegant place in the world. I even rate Oxford above Cambridge, even though I have no reason to have an opinion on it. You do too. Okay, good. We've got an agreement already. So we're going to speak with a theologian slash peacemaker slash physician. Is that fair enough? Elizabeth Carmichael, who is a retired professor and a current fellow in doing research in theology and peace building at the University of Oxford in England. So good morning, Professor. Nice to meet you.
Good morning, Meta.
But let's start off by just getting a little bit acquainted about your own personal background. You began studying theology at Oxford long ago, before you went into medicine. Is that correct?
Not quite. I came formally to theology later on.
Oh.
I was actually heading for a history place at Oxford, but at that point I managed to switch. And instead I arrived in Oxford as a medical student.
Mm-hmm. And now you wear clerical collars, so you're an Anglican priest as well as a physician and a number of other things. Very good. So you were studying history.
Well, it was when apartheid was a very big issue, especially among students and activists. And I studied medicine in order to work somewhere in Africa. Didn't matter really where, but I spent as a student some months in Tanzania and then another month in Zambia, both doing medicine as a medical student. And it was obvious that the situation in South Africa was disturbing people in Central and East Africa as well. People were all looking over their shoulders and supporting the liberation movements and so on. And so I went in my last months as a medical student on an exploratory expedition to South Africa to find out what really was going on there. I should add that, theologically speaking, I had become involved with the meetings at Thésée in France, an ecumenical monastery, which still today attracts masses of young people just to go there and to discuss how to make a difference in the world, and with a very strong emphasis on reconciliation and peace.
Thésée, did you say?
Yes, it's a little village called Thésée, T-A-I-Z or Z-E, Thésée, acute, the E acute.
Yeah.
It's in Burgundy, and it's where an ecumenical monastery with Protestants and Catholics began in 1944, and during the 60s it began to attract young people just to go and camp there. And today you're going to find in any typical week in summer about 6,000 young people from all over Europe and all over the world. They also have meetings in other places. It began with an emphasis, of course, on reconciling post-war Europe. So, for example, the big church there was built by German volunteers.
So you, as still a medical student, you go off to Africa.
The population of Soweto was at least 1 million at that time, possibly pushing for 2 million, and it's millions now. So this very big teaching hospital serves Soweto, and I got the opportunity to apply for a job there. And so after I'd qualified and after I had spent my basic training partly in Newfoundland and Labrador, I headed for Soweto. And I was a doctor there in Baragwanath Hospital for 7 years.
Oh.
And those were the years when Soweto exploded. The high school students of Soweto rebelled against the poor education that the apartheid government was offering them. And some of them went over the border to join the liberation armies. Others finished up on Robben Island as political prisoners. And many stayed in the townships. And it was just a time of unrest and never really calm from the mid-70s until Mandela was released in 1990. And so South Africa became a very complex place of conflict, with two major conflicts, the government and police versus the majority of the people. And then among the Black community, the conservative Zulus against the ANC, which was making the youth unruly. Young comrades were attacking authority and not listening to their elders, and this was not found to be pleasing by conservative Zulus. The ANC in 1985 called on the people to make South Africa ungovernable, in particular to make the townships ungovernable, and that involved quite a lot of violence, which came primarily from the youth who were disrupting township administration and attacking the police.
Of course, later we always think of Mandela as almost a pacifist, but I was aware that he wasn't quite that. And how much of a non-pacifist was he, or how violent was the ANC in those days?
Well, the ANC was quite a broad church. It contained quite fierce hawks and very strong doves. Mandela was, in a way, in the middle and could be either. I think that would be an accurate summing up. In 1961, after the shootings at Sharpeville, which really was the point at which the South African conflict turned violent, it was Mandela who led in forming an armed wing. It was set up as independent, but it was pretty much recognized from the beginning as the armed wing of the ANC. It was called MK, Umkhonto we Sizwe, and he was the chair of its high command. So he was head of MK, and it was for that reason that he was arrested, and his friends and he were subjected to the Rivonia trial and then imprisoned for life on Robben Island. Now, MK's policy was to sabotage infrastructure, electricity substations, pylons, administration offices, and so on, and try not to kill people. And official operations of MK from 1961 right through to 1990 killed only 240 people within South Africa. Now, the unofficial operations, because by the end of that period, a lot of people were being trained in South Africa and taking part in the township violence, that if you add those deaths, that would be many more. So it was both an organization that tried not to kill people, and Mandela explicitly said that was the best hope for reconciliation between the races afterwards. And it also did take part in indiscriminate violence, where the body count is always rather difficult to distinguish from crime and so on.
He personally is treated as a very genial and certainly kindly person who was remarkable for his ability to reconcile with the previous white leaders of the country.
That's correct. But when necessary, he took up arms when he felt it was necessary. That the only way forward, having tried everything else, and they did try, they called for a national convention, they tried to get into dialogue with the government. It was all refused. And the shootings at Sharpeville indicated that the government was going to be intransigent, and that change was not going to come easily. It was at that point that Mandela decided that the time had come to take up arms. But as I've said, in a way that hopefully didn't kill too many people. That is in contrast to the ANC's rival organization, which had broken away in 1961. That's the Pan-Africanist Congress, which did explicitly want to kill white people and police and the authorities.
Did you feel yourself to be at risk working in a hospital in or near Soweto?
No, never.
No?
The only time, well, when the conflict broke out in 1976, a lot of riot police arrived in camouflage uniforms, and I had to drive to the hospital each day. We all did, the white staff, and there were about 500 white doctors there. And on one occasion, I went through a police checkpoint where one of these camouflage lads offered to get into my car and drive with me the few hundred yards down to the hospital, and I just said, no, thanks. Because I would have been much more of a target with him in my car than I was just driving around. And I used to drive around Soweto at all times of the day and night, even though officially I wasn't supposed to.
And you felt safe enough? Uh-huh.
Oh, yes, completely. And I had a lot of friends in Soweto.
Just yesterday, I did a talk show with two friends who had been on a cruise starting in Cape Town, I think, and it was during the COVID thing, so they weren't able to get off ship in any of the places where they expected to be, or except, I think, two of the places. But one of them was telling me about having, even on that trip, I think, before boarding the ship, he had taken a trip to Soweto, and there had been a car following him in case he got into trouble. And I said, well, you mean a flat tire, or do you mean guerrillas? And he said either or both. And I was quite shocked, because I thought, well, this day and age, that shouldn't be necessary.
It wouldn't be any other reason than crime. There is a considerable amount of gratuitously violent crime. Mm-hmm. So I think that a tour operator would want to be sure that people didn't get mugged.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you spent 7 years there, and well, what was the takeaway from that experience?
Goodness, I spent 7 years as a doctor. Mm-hmm. And then the opportunity came to do what I'd always intended to do sometime, and that is to go back to university and do theology. So, gosh, the takeaway from my 7 years as a medic, there are many, but I think of one thing. In the period in 1976, after the school rioting had started, and it was pretty bloody, and I was in the operating theatres. I was an anesthesiologist at that time. So I was seeing all these kids coming in with gunshot wounds and learning the different kinds of ordnance that were being used and so on. And it calmed down for a bit, and I was on holiday back in Europe. And at Heathrow, I had always been excited to get on the next plane and get to the next place. At Heathrow, at the end of that holiday in 1976, I suddenly, from my gut, and I didn't know it was there, came the feeling, I don't want to get on that plane. And it was the reality of the situation, the pain of the situation suddenly hitting me. Of course, I did get on the plane, and next day I was back in the hospital, but I kind of moved beyond the gung-ho, James Bond is here sort of attitude to South Africa. And I'd realized that this really was a serious place where people were getting hurt.
And that in your priorities, becoming a theologian was more a way of serving the Lord or humankind than medicine.
Well, I'd realized early on when I was a medical student that if ordination were possible, that is what I would offer for. My medical vocation was partly a missionary vocation anyway. It was actually suggested to me during an interview with a mission society that I should be a doctor or nurse or a teacher or a social worker, and being a doctor stuck. So it was really all of a piece. And I was fascinated by theology, still am. And so I went back, well, I deviated to Cambridge for a year and then ran away back to Oxford and did the degree in Oxford in theology, the BA, which was really very good, much more scholarly, I must say, than it is now, unfortunately. And then I did a doctorate, which eventually became a book on the language of friendship to describe Christian love throughout the ages. Really? And then it was at the end of 1990, I went back to South Africa as an ordinand, and Desmond Tutu played quite a part in making sure that I did go back as an ordinand to South Africa.
The idea that you did a degree in medicine already, with the idea that it was part of your work as a theologian or as a prospective priest in the Anglican Church, that is a bit surprising to me. Did you have a sense that you that you had a kind of a mission or a calling or a vocation to become a priest all along? And that how was medicine related to that?
Well, it's not so unusual that a doctor becomes a priest or vice versa. In fact, I know several other people who have combined the two.
Yeah.
Well, it was while I was a medical at the time when medicine was suggested. It was just before the conversation about women priests really opened up in the Anglican Church. It was only in 1971 that it became official that the different provinces of the Anglican Communion worldwide could make their own decision about whether to ordain women and still remain within the Anglican Communion. And as you probably know, the first official ordinations were about 1975. So the unofficial one, of course, had happened in 1944 in China, but that's a whole other story.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, that's Florence Lee Tim Oy, who ended up in Toronto. Her sister settled in Toronto, and eventually she did, and she ministered to a Chinese congregation in Toronto. Mm. So when I was thinking what to study originally, ordination wasn't really on the cards. I was interested in theology, but that would only lead to being perhaps a religious studies teacher in school, and I didn't particularly want to do that.
I see. So the difference was the church gave up resisting you along the way, and it became possible.
And it wasn't just me.
Because if you could have become a priest straight away, you would have done it, I guess.
Well, I probably would have done, yes. I'd certainly have probably studied theology at that point, yes.
Okay.
So Desmond Tutu had a lot to do with persuading the Southern African province to go ahead. It almost happened in 1989, and I went back to Johannesburg in the beginning of 91. Mm-hmm. By the end of that year, I was a deacon, which had been possible for some years. And then in 92, it was possible to go ahead and ordain us as priests. So that's what happened. So
Okay.
1992 in Johannesburg.
So that makes sense. You became a priest in Johannesburg. All right. So now you were doing priestly work in South Africa and doing peace work.
I was officially doing a job in the Diocese of Johannesburg under the bishop, a sort of roving job in theological education and spirituality. And I was concentrating on the townships because that was the scene I knew. And because of that, I got sucked in when the peace committees under the National Peace Accord came down to the ground. The peace accord was signed as the first consensus document on a multi-party basis in September of 1991. That's 18 months or so, a bit more after Mandela had been released. And what was supposed to happen when the new President de Klerk released Mandela and unbanned the liberation movements was two things. Multi-party talks were going to begin towards creating a new constitution and arranging a democratic election. So constitutional change was going to happen. And the other thing that was going to happen was that this other war, which I'd mentioned before, between the ANC and the conservative Zulus, who were a force to be reckoned with in a movement called Inkatha, which became the Inkatha Freedom Party. This civil war, which had broken out in the 80s in KwaZulu-Natal, was going to stop because Mandela and Buthelezi did know each other and they were supposed to meet. But the hawks in the ANC prevented Mandela from meeting Buthelezi, and the conflict just got worse. So you'd still got, in 1991, the conflict between the liberation movements, the people generally, and the government, and this other thing, the civil war between the ANC and Inkatha. So to unpick all of that, when talks had finally broken down at top level, facilitators who were church leaders and business leaders got together, and they managed to get the politicians into one room in June of 1991. And from that, they negotiated the National Peace Accord, and that set up peace committees. And that's where I came in. I was parachuted onto a peace committee in another township called Alexandra in Johannesburg on April Fool's Day, 1992, with 4 colleagues, and we were sent to sort out the war, which we proceeded to do.
Okay. You must have already had a pretty good idea where you were going to go with that before you were appointed. Is that right? And were you all of the same mind, all of your team?
Well, yes. I mean, we were ANC, IFP, churches, that was me, the Democratic Party, which is the moderate white party, and a friend of mine who came in as relief organizations, who knew Alexandra very well. Well, yes, I mean, for the first time in South Africa's history, we had a common document to work from. We were in contact with the administration and the security forces. I could phone up the police brigadier or the army colonel at any time of the day or night, and they came onto the committee within 3 weeks or so. And we made an extraordinary team, and all over the country, the same thing was happening. For the first time, people were being offered a constructive way forward, an alternative to violence. Mm. And it worked. In 1994, South Africa had an exemplary election. But the hidden story behind that is the story of the peace accord. And that's what I've just written a book on. And I'm just trying to cut down words in it just now.
Oh, really? Okay. Before we go on to talking about your work at Oxford, I want to ask you about your judgment about the peace and reconciliation process. I think the whole idea has been attempted in many places a number of different countries have tried to have a Peace and Reconciliation Commission, and I think some more successfully than others. My impression is that if anything succeeded, if it succeeded anywhere, it was mostly South Africa that did it well, and that it was maybe more successful there than some of the other places. But I'd like to hear your thought about it, and about the question of how punitive, how much punitiveness must remain in the system in order to leave the previous victims with any sense of justice, if I can summarize it that quickly.
Yes. Well, transitional justice is quite an industry. One of the organizations in Oxford is the Oxford Transitional Justice Research Group, which in normal times has a live seminar every week in term. It's gone on to Zoom, of course, but we're coming off Zoom now for the next term, so that's good. So South Africa was fortunate in that it wasn't the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission. People imagine that it was the first, but it wasn't. Mm. And it was also fortunate in that it didn't have to hurry in setting it up, and it did not set it up as part of the original peace process. So we had 4 years of the National Peace Accord and the peace committees, and training people as peace monitors and so on. And as part of those structures, we had a commission which was regarding the prevention of public violence and intimidation. So the purpose of that commission, which became known as the Goldstone Commission because Judge Goldstone headed it, was to investigate what had happened in violence incidents and make recommendations about police behavior, political party behavior, and so on, to prevent that kind of violence happening again. So it wasn't a punitive or retributive sort of commission at all, but it did lay some groundwork for the later TRC. Now, the parallel with the peace process under the National Peace Accord, there were the constitutional talks, which came up with an interim constitution at the end of 1993, under which the election was going to be held in 1994. And a little codicil was put at the end of the interim constitution, and it simply said there will be amnesty. How it was going to be applied was left for the new government of national unity to decide. And then it was possible, after the election in 94, to have workshops with 3 countries which had previously had truth commissions: Chile, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And people came from those countries to Cape Town, workshops were held, and it was decided how the South African TRC was going to be set up and what its parameters were going to be. And Desmond Tutu was appointed as chair. So it always had an ethos of confession and forgiveness, which was quite all right for some people, not adequate for others. But the rule was that if the commissioners decided that you had told the truth and told the full truth, you would be given amnesty. If not, you were subject to the courts, to ordinary courts of law. You didn't get amnesty. So that's basically how the TRC operated. And it worked magnificently as a public education exercise. A lot of the hearings were live on TV, and every Sunday evening there was a compendium program which brought you up to date on the hearings of that previous week. And whites watched it in large numbers and said, "Now I understand. I really didn't know before," and they didn't.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for sure, confession or remorse was a condition.
Confession, some people were remorseful and others didn't look terribly remorseful. But a lot did, actually. The worst time for dirty tricks was the late 1980s, and actual dirty tricks departments were set up in the police and the army, which most of the police and the army didn't know anything about. These were clandestine units. And people who worked with them, Eugene de Kock, for example, became really remorseful. I mean, you know, they're really sorry for what they did.
Okay, I had a few months ago a talk show with a very close friend of mine, Joy Kogawa, about the question of whether Christian teaching requires or proposes, recommends, let's say, unconditional forgiveness at all times toward everyone, without regard to whether or not there is any acknowledgement of culpability or guilt. And Joy is a very spiritual friend of mine. She's a poet and a very well-known Canadian writer. You may know her name. She was frankly going on about how good it feels to forgive. And I quite agree. It feels wonderful to forgive when you can really forgive. But I don't think that it's always possible, and indeed that it's always even appropriate to forgive when a person has not acknowledged wrongdoing. And I referred to a talk show that I had seen with a woman theologian who specializes in patristics. And she was asked about whether or not the early church fathers insisted upon unconditional forgiveness for all church members. And she said no. She found that in the early days of the church, the leaders of each congregation would go to a wrongdoer along with the person who'd been injured or who had a complaint, and have a conversation and require that there be a confession and an acknowledgement of having done wrong, and then there could be and would be forgiveness. And I think that in just plain ordinary, whether you're a Christian or anything, ordinary psychology pretty much requires that in order to be truly able to forgive, it's a transactional situation where the wrongdoer must acknowledge some responsibility, or there must be some kind of accountability before ordinary people are actually capable of forgiving serious infractions. And of course, we make allowances for people who, as I thought about Christ on the cross, as Joy said, well, he forgave. He said, Father, forgive them. But he also added, for they know not what they do. And to me, that is part of the, even in law courts, that the judge would say whether this person is capable of knowing what he or she had done and fully understanding the implications at the time. And if they didn't know, then you can be lenient or forgiving because the person is not capable. They were maybe a child, or they were drunk, or they were somehow not able to know what they were doing. And therefore, it's easier to forgive people who were not really in full command of their capacities at the time. Okay, that's my theology. Tell me what your theology is on the question of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Well, I guess I would tend to follow Desmond Tutu from a practical point of view, and he is a confessor. Obviously, he comes from the Anglo-Catholic side of the church, the Anglican Church, and is used to hearing confessions and so on. And he did run the Truth and Reconciliation Commission very much in that way, so that people did need to confess. And as I said, the TRC was set up on the basis that if you were deemed to have told the whole truth and not to be holding things back, you could be given amnesty from prosecution.
Mm-hmm. And psychologically, when it came to the forgiveness on the part of the victims.
Yeah, well, Tutu was criticized for sometimes appearing to try to put pressure on the victims, so saying, "Can you forgive?" I don't think he was really putting pressure. He was making an invitation.
In your experience, what proportion of people were and are regularly able to forgive a serious case in which they were victimized? Would most people at the end really feel satisfied that I've heard of some cases, even in South Africa. I remember a story about a woman and her daughter who go into a prison cell to visit a man who had killed the woman's husband. And he was so remorseful that at the end, when she and her daughter left, they hugged each other.
Mm.
This is certainly possible, but how common is that? And what are we to make of people who simply can't get to that phase?
I don't think there are any statistics that one can quote. Certainly not that I know of, but the story you've just mentioned is certainly not unique. I mentioned Eugene de Kock, who was commander of the security branch police dirty tricks unit, a place called Vlakplaas, who did some pretty horrible things. And in 1992, for no real particular reason, he was involved in shooting several black people down in Nelspruit, in the east, what was then the Eastern Transvaal, in Mpumalanga. And one of them was a man called Mr. Mama, and his daughter Candace is now an activist for reconciliation, and the whole family visited Eugene de Kock in prison. He was very remorseful, and they were part of the campaign for his parole, and in the end he was given parole.
My guess is that my point of view is not all that unusual for, let's say, average Christians, mm-hmm. and would not be regarded as a deviant point of view by many theologians, Christian theologians. Yeah. Are there people who are on a campaign to encourage everybody to forgive everybody else? From my point of view, it means not holding anybody accountable for anything, which I don't know how you would maintain society without it.
Well, no, I don't think I've said that I'm of that view. I think there's a sort of NGO which operates here in Britain. I'm not sure how much it operates beyond our shores, called the Forgiveness Project. If you look up their website, you'll see stories and how they approach things. But I think that they also tend to take the line that people have to do some thinking and reflecting and owning up in order to be forgiven. I mean, there has to be a give and take, a relationship. It's the restoration of the creation of a relationship that never was there before, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. Okay, thank you for this. I think This is something that has been on my mind a lot. Let's go back to, let's get you back into England now. At some point or other, you came back to Oxford. Tell me about that.
Well, after I had worked on the peace committees and done a bit of mopping up afterwards and completed what I wanted to do in my diocesan work, which was mainly getting people trained in spiritual direction and so on, then it was time to, at least for a short time, I thought, go back to Oxford and turn my thesis into a book, because its examiners, who included Rowan Williams, had said this should be published. So I put it on the shelf and hadn't been able to do anything with it for the last 5-6 years. So at that point, I applied for the job of chaplain and tutor in theology at St. John's College, Oxford, and was given the job, and then realized that I wasn't going to be writing a book for some time because I needed to build up sabbatical time. So it took a little time, but the book came out eventually, and it's been a successful book. So that's good. And meanwhile, I was doing two full-time jobs, one as tutor in theology and the other as chaplain to what was by now quite a large college. And I was, in fact, the last person in Oxford to do this traditional thing of combining being chaplain and tutor in theology. For my last 5 years, I was the last person to do that, though it had been quite normal during the 20th.
For people to hold two full-time jobs, in effect. And
yes.
Okay, but you are, what is it? The Oxford Peace, is it committee? The whole project. This is something beyond being a tutor at the college. It's Oxford wide, is it? This project? Tell me about it.
Yes, well, I went back to Oxford in 1996, and it wasn't for a few years that I got my mind towards thinking, why do we not study peace in Oxford? And up to that point, peace had been regarded as a rather amorphous subject, not worthy of academic attention. Perhaps it was a negative thing. Peace is just the absence of violence, so what else is there to say about peace? But it turns out that there's a great deal more to be said positively about peace and about the work of peacemaking. I mean, I was aware of that because we had been training people in the peace committees in mediation and conflict resolution and so on. So there's a lot to learn about peacemaking. There's much more to learn about peace building, which really is a continuous thing. And peacekeeping, well, that's usually assigned to the police or army to keep a peace that has been agreed. So there's a lot there. What is the nature of peace? How do you make it? How do you build it in very different contexts around the world? And how do you keep it? And it came to me and a few friends in about 2006 that we needed to start talking about why doesn't Oxford specifically study peace? Could we find a donor and set up a chair in peace studies? And that is now possible. We just need the donor. And it's about £4 million. So, well, it could be £3 million. Yeah. So posts are beginning to appear, though, with the name of peace in them. And that wouldn't have happened before. And that's partly because of all the work we have done as the Oxford Network of Peace Studies, OxPeace, which exists to promote the study of peace and peace building and so on in Oxford and beyond. And since 2009, we've had an annual conference. Our idea is that every discipline has something to contribute to peace. So we have on the committee quite a wide number of disciplines, from international development to ornithology and
Yes, you mentioned that ornithology as one end
Yep.
of some kind of spectrum that exists in your mind. What in the world is on? What do birds have to do with it?
Well, if I quote you our working definition of peace, it's human flourishing and human security in a sustainable environment, and that's where birds tend to come into it, with the constructive management of conflict. So human flourishing and human security in a sustainable environment with the constructive management of conflict. So you can get quite a few conferences out of that.
But not birds. I don't, unless you're really looking at hawks and doves. If you're looking at those two.
Well, two things. I mean, birds exist in the environment, and we are messing up the environment for ourselves and the birds, especially migratory birds, and all sorts of birds. And the other thing is you can actually do peace building through bird watching if you happen to be Israeli and Palestinian.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's cute. I hadn't thought of that. Okay, well, I got a 20-year jump on you because I was involved back in the 80s with Science for Peace and starting the Peace and Conflict program at the University of Toronto. And then I was teaching at one of the satellite campuses. We have one on one side of the city and one on the other. And I was at the Arundel campus. So I started a program in peace and conflict studies there and ran it for 13 years until I retired. And then I kept on teaching it for free, one or two of the courses, because the students kept liking it. And I kept doing it. But what we did, and I'd be interested in whether your approach was similar or not. I agree with you that it has to be a very interdisciplinary program. So I taught most of the core courses, but there were programs in where we were allowed to include courses in everything from psychology to history to all kinds of philosophy, you name it. The only thing we couldn't include were political science courses, because for some reason the political scientists, I think, have a sense of proprietorship over conflict and didn't appreciate having their turf trod upon. So we were not allowed to give credit for political science courses in this program. But we did have courses on development. Now, at that point, I wouldn't say that the awareness of global warming was anything close to what it is now. And Lord knows it's not close enough, as you know, we are not mindful enough about the threat that we, I think, face. But we did have, there was more awareness of the importance of development and to some extent then the economy and the environment in that connection. So I would say the closest relationship may have been to development studies if I was looking at one allied field of research. I probably oh my goodness, I think we had graduated something like 20 degrees per year in peace studies for the 12 years at least that I ran the program. And then they closed it when I retired because, and I wasn't disappointed, because I knew that, frankly, people in other departments didn't have a clue what peace studies is or could be. And therefore, they would have, if they kept it going, they would have just pointed to anybody at random and said, you teach peace studies. And, I think Kenneth Boulding once wrote an article, maybe you're familiar with it, saying that peace studies could be an academic discipline, because he looked at the criteria for what it takes to be a full freestanding academic discipline, and includes things like being able to give an exam for your own graduates and make sure that when you vet the person as a qualified professional, that they have something in common. And in particular, that there be a core body of knowledge that everybody's expected to have mastered, and so on.
Mhm.
And I think we have those things. And this Kenneth Boulding took that position, that we did have all of those qualities that, and could become an independent academic discipline. But as far as I know, it's never happened. And in a way, I'm surprised that you say you didn't have anything in peace studies at Oxford until a few years ago. Well, Bradford existed quite a while back, and maybe Bradford's program was, I don't know, I don't think it's the only one in Britain, but it was going in the 80s, wasn't it?
It was founded in 1973, I think.
Yeah.
It was a new university, and it branched out into peace, partly because there was some money available from a Quaker source. And the first professor, Adam Curl, was also a Quaker.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
For quite a long time, it was the only department. There are now programs in many other places, and chairs and lectureships in peace are not as rare as they used to be at all.
Would you say it's growing? That really?
It has been growing, definitely. Worldwide, it's been growing, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't really followed it so much for the last few years. I was very engaged when I was still teaching, but it's been 20 some years since I retired. And I was involved with something called COPRED, Consortium on Peace Research, Education, and Development in the US, which then sort of morphed into something called the Peace Studies Association, and it keeps changing its name and identity. But I have been active in that organization for a long time. And I don't think there's IPRA, there's the International Peace Research Association, which I guess is the only thing that we would have that would be global in scope for peace researchers and peace educators, right?
Yes, I think so.
Mm-hmm. And I presume that Oxford is engaged in that.
Well, there are a number of people at Oxford who, for example, one of the people who helped to start OxPeace was an editor of the IPRA magazine journal.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. Well, our time is up, and I think we've only scratched the surface. I'd like to spend another 2 or 3 hours with you, and particularly as some of these things that we do have in common. I don't have any background in South African affairs, and I'm afraid I wasn't able to ask even very smart questions. But I certainly think that we have a common interest when it comes to peace education. And I'm delighted to know that you say that the whole field is growing as such. Okay.
It is. I mean, as I said, in 96 to 2006, before I really started thinking about this in Oxford, definitely there were no posts that mentioned peace. Now at the Blavatnik School of Government, there's a program on international governance and peace, which certainly wouldn't have happened a few years ago. I mean, it's become respectable to talk about peace in the academic
That's wonderful.
cloisters of Oxford.
Okay, I'm delighted that it's respectable. I think after the fact, I would like to claim some of that respectability myself, because I always felt I was kind of a deviant, and certainly as a sociologist, for sure, I was deviant. This is not considered an appropriate part of sociological research, which is my field.
Well, OxPeace has an official existence as an associated project of the Centre for International Studies within the Department of Politics and International Relations. So there you are. That's respectability.
Congratulations. I'm sure you had a hand in that. Okay, this has been fun. I really appreciate it. So good wishes to you for carrying on the campaign.
Thank you very much, Meta.
Okay, bye.
Bye.